But given the gout that I was suffering from and the kidney stones, during the conventional proceedings, they bore me with great pomp and circumstance from my home to the State House. It made quite the spectacle, and well, I will confess, it's the highest status way to travel.
Oh my goodness! I mean, that does seem pretty remarkable. How did you find the gentleman?
Uh, the prison.
Oh, oh, I think we are live. So, welcome to this primary source media live stream. I am Isaac Loftus, the co host of Too Complicated for History, and I am joined today by the Dr. Benjamin Franklin. And we are
Good morning.
here not to talk about how he was carried by prisoners to the Constitutional Convention because he could not walk up the stairs or just walk in general.
At that point, any amount of movement fostered great pain in my extremities.
Yeah, so no no walking for him at that time, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We can talk about that later. We are here to talk about episode 7 of Apple TV Plus's series Franklin, starring Michael Douglas, which opens. We talked about in the last live stream how we were going to get to the Yorktown and the end of the war. I didn't realize how quickly we would get there. It's the first scene as we see this render.
I was not present, clearly, at the Battle of Yorktown. I had other things going on. And so I was
It's a funny way to put that. You were busy.
I was busy that day. I couldn't pop down. And so I looked forward, particularly becoming accustomed to this new medium, seeing things recreated before your eyes, to seeing the spectacle, the intrigue, to see what many call as the world turned upside down, and a quick moment upon the surrender field. Now I do understand, Monsieur the Marquis de Lafayette's decision to play Yankee Doodle, completely accurate, completely true, but it was missing something, and perhaps it was because I found myself starved for the spectacle of seeing that particular battle before my eyes, seeing the aftermath, seeing what it means and its significance. That was truly missing in that scene of what the soldiers went through, well, upon both sides. The British undergoing several weeks of siege, the Americans and French, again, former enemies, coming together and, in spite of all of their expectation, prevailing. That was missing in that scene for me. It seemed just another surrender from a battle, and the significance was missing.
Yeah, it left me wanting as well. But I will say, given how large that could have been a series in and of itself. You know, this series is titled Franklin, and I wasn't entirely surprised that we just see a glimpse of it and then jump back to France to.
There was also a beautiful opportunity to see a cameo from General Washington. There's a wonderful story at Surrender Field.
Hmm?
You see, Charles Cornwallis was not there that day. He was under the weather. Uh, and so Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, his second in command, was the one to deliver the sword of surrender.
Hmm.
And he tries to give this sword to the Comte de Rochambeau, to
Oh,
which Rochambeau says, I did not command. Washington did. And so he tries to hand the sword to Washington, and Washington says, I'm not going to accept the sword from your second in command. Give it to my second in command. And he gives it to Benjamin Lincoln.
huh.
And I wondered for a moment if we would see that moment, that story, because again, what is this pageantry? It's a demonstration of American and French relations, and I think it a wonderful moment. And perhaps it was because the show did not build to that, and we had no relationship with Rochambeau or Washington. But I would have liked to have
I
seen it. I
think you
would.
could have gotten away with it just purely in the fact that Rochambeau has a French accent, right? And the dynamic between an American sitting next to a French guy is sort of something that we've seen play out in this series. You could have, I would have. That's an interesting take. Maybe not have been a bad idea. Maybe we got to get you to Hollywood to see if you can pen some of these. Not a bad thought. But yeah, I think it was. So we get back immediately after Yorktown to what is essentially the negotiations for peace. That's what this episode is about. Like, is about the how the dynamics of that negotiation that will lead to the Treaty of Paris sort of get going. Um, their favorite uh, character is back, Mr.
What
Adams.
a, what about Newfoundland?
Right. There's a as far as the negotiations went, how did you see this all playing out post Yorktown, pre getting into the thick of things? Because we fairly quickly get into the thick of the dynamics between Adams, John Jay, and the rest of the American delegation, and in contrast to the French court. But how did you see it when Yorktown happened? What was your reaction to that?
Relief. Um, in May of 1781, I write to the Marquis de Lafayette,
Mm-hmm.
who is at that present moment in Virginia, uh, in what can only be truly summarized as a game of cat and mouse of the British chasing American forces all through Virginia. It seems to be a really and truly dark hour. And in that letter, I remark and say, I don't suspect I'll see the end of this war.
Hmm.
I think it will go on significantly longer. I write to him that French supplies are coming, that a ship that bears his name, the Lafayette, is inbound. But the reconnaissance that Washington is in New York and will be soon making the march to Virginia, it's not arrived yet, and it's kept very discreet. So suddenly to hear news of not just a victory, but an unconditional surrender of half, truly, of Britain's armed forces in America, a decisive and strategic victory, was overwhelming. It gave us the boon through which we could begin to speak in mediations. Now enters a very new game.
Mm.
So you see, in truth, we have seen in this series the trinity of three games: courting France to secure alliance, maintaining alliance and winning the war, and then finally determining to what end after this war we should be friends with France.
Sure.
When we look to what America wished for from the beginning of our revolution, if we're to say the beginning was 1765, even perhaps prior to that in the French and Indian War when the seeds were planted, the scales to which what we desired varied.
Hmm.
So 1765, what did America want? It wanted a degree of economic autonomy that it had always had. It wanted the return to a status quo, what we had always enjoyed. As legislation continued to move in Parliament and further the divide between Englishmen and colonists, or what would become American, it became less of a conversation about economy and a conversation about liberty as we considered it. Even then, the civic liberty, the Roman liberty, the liberty derived from privilege versus the natural liberty we'll see in our Declaration of Independence. Even in 1776, what did we want? We wanted an olive branch. And I, through the tenor of my writings leading up to our independence, was a proud Englishman who wished for a return to that feeling of patriotism that I'd carried for the majority of my life, you understand. Around this time, we want it all.
Hmm.
And you see that of we want Canada, we want the whole continent, we want to be unbothered and rid forever
Yeah, I believe
of
Michael
Great Britain.
Douglas's Franklin says to gain much and to give little, or something along that lines. When John Jay is first arrives. Um,
And I write that there is no such thing as a good war, a good war or a bad peace.
okay.
I think above all to be said is peace is desirous, but what transpires in this episode and these conversations will be a conversation that will carry through the next 30 years of diplomacy between America and Great Britain, long after my time, long after I'm dead,
Hmm.
that will carry and eventually be a major cause of the War of 1812.
Right.
Uh, because these unanswered questions or these things left on the table, the desire for Canada, sovereignty upon the seas, I'm surprised, and I suspect not surprised, because it would have taken more unpacking, I think is the term you use, to talk about naval impressment of the
Right.
Royal Navy taking American sailors and pressing them into service.
Impressing not to mean in yeah, that term doesn't mean the same thing anymore.
Yes. We wanted an end to naval impressment. We don't want any more gaudy ships.
No, no,
They're
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 too
making
impressive.
they're making our ships feel inferior. You have to make less impressive ships. No, naval impressment is specifically filling the rosters with sailors, and this often involved kidnapping individuals who are not British subjects. And the problem is we speak the same language, so how do you tell the difference?
Right.
And many English sailors desert in American ports. So the press gang comes in, and how are you to determine who is an Englishman and who is an American?
Yeah, on Too Complicated for History, we actually did an episode about impressment with Dr. Denver Brunsman, which is fantastic. I'm sure our producer will post the link in the chat.
So the most important question of the day was that impressive?
The podcast episode? I thought so.
Good. Uh, and I believe we see different personalities in the room. I think for the British as well.
Hmm.
Um, and we see different ends. We see division between Franklin, Jay, and Adams. We see some triangulation of how to what ends we we will secure our independence. So now this whole series is about obtaining our independency. Now it's we have our independency. Who are we going to be to the wider world?
Right.
And you see Jay and Adams conspire and say, well, maybe we can find a better deal with the English if we cut out the French. And we see the French pressing for what they want America to be. Um, this whole series, I think, can be truly distilled into a story about the world telling a protagonist, whether it's myself, whether it's Temple, whether it's America, who it should be,
Hmm.
and the protagonist going on the journey to determine for themselves what they'll be. And for Temple, it has one sort of flair. For myself as an old man, I know not if there's a grand. It's more of a man reconciling with what the world has told him he should be.
Sure.
Um, and then, of course, for America, for better or worse, we see the opportunity to determine what it will be.
Yeah. That very much feels like that's what's playing out. Um, how did you feel about the distillation? That's how I'll put it of that American delegation. There's only three of you in the room as part of this series, which was not the case in reality. Am I mistaken?
I wish to know what PR company did John Jay hire to paint him in so favorable a light with this series? He is a man who, very much in this series, seemed to keep his cool and be very standoffish. And I'm not insinuating that Mr. J was not that, but uh, he was not the diplomat they make him out to be in this. Now, Mr. J was abroad for a good portion of the proceedings, minister and ambassador in Spain, and he knew the game, but perhaps the picture they were painting for both Adams and Jay was to honor and perhaps foreshadow their relationship with the British Empire after the War for Independence, because both will eventually become staunch Federalists.
Hmm.
Again, somewhat after my time, once America breaks itself into political parties. John Jay will be notorious both in the 1780s uh, with Spain as well as with England of making truly bad treaties that cripple America. He makes two in his life, and the first, the Jay Gardoqui Treaty, loses American navigation rights on the Mississippi River. And then there's the one in the 1790s, which further ignites political party scandal and causes Washington to fall out with several prolific American figures that were invaluable assets and friends to him.
Yeah, the character that they have of John Jay in this series feels a little bit like he was a combination of a few folks. I actually thought it might have been Thomas Jefferson in that carriage.
I thought the same because it's not uncommon to refer to an individual. This is an era of formalities. It's very rare you will use someone's Christian name. It will be their surname
Right,
and whatever honorary. So, Dr. Franklin,
right.
Mr. Jefferson. But it's not uncommon to use the first initial
Hmm.
of Mr. J, Mr. A. So I thought the same. I wondered, oh, they've brought young Thomas Jefferson into the scene, and Mr. Jefferson is a very socially awkward creature. So at first I thought Mr. J was handling that quite well, but no, alas, it was not. Um, and I was very pleased uh, to see the introduction and representation of the enslavement of Africans in America in this
I
episode.
think this is the first time we've seen anyone that is enslaved in the show. This is the first. This is the first depiction of an enslaved butler. For those who haven't seen the episode, John Jay arrives in a carriage with an enslaved butler, and John Adams doesn't quite know what to make of it, which is a little strange. But I thought they did do a good job of exploring what was the New York attitude towards slavery. There's some understanding, I think, publicly since the Hamilton, the series,
Mhm.
the play about what um, the anti-slavery movement and the manumission societies in New York. Is it manumission or abolition society? I think it's manumission
So
society.
the term abolitionist is
Is
somewhat after my time.
is
So
later, right?
so
Yeah.
around this time, one out of every seven people in New York, particularly in New York City, is going to be a person of color or enslaved, so free or a person of color. In the South, it becomes somewhat more 50-50.
Hmm.
In the course of my life, will have somewhere in the window of seven enslaved people, most notably Peter and his wife Jemima. While I'm in Europe, I will have Caesar, an enslaved person under my care, who will leave. And I will be an ardent participant and will write early in my life various things detracting of the character of that particular class and condition of people. Really, things that are worth saying or
Hmm.
worth reading to understand my sentiment. And late in life, I will return to those words and say I was wrong.
Hmm.
It was so wrong to have those opinions. And I'll speak to the character of them, and more than that, the danger of making generalizations of that nature.
Interesting.
And I'll speak out against the institution. And one of the last things I become involved in my life is a Quaker movement to abolish the institution of slavery. I speak out against it in my life, and I make sure that when I die, uh, the various people associated that are called property in my time are manumitted. I become very against the institution, very uncomfortable with it, and I do not see the progress of America, or more than that, the what America stands for, to be in harmony with the institution. So I think it's essential in any of these stories to include them because it is the American story,
Right.
hand in hand.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely necessary to explore, and I'm happy that they were able to include it even in this small way. If Lynn, if you're watching, I think it's the Manumission Society of New York and Philadelphia that I'm thinking of, those organizations, but I could be entirely correct. But John Jay is a member of that society in New York, but they were very different. The one in Philadelphia was a little bit more proactive, and to genuinely against the institution of slavery, and the Manumission Society of New York was more like the way John Jay talks about it in the television show. It's yes, in theory, that is a good thing, but I have to make sure that we are made whole. And by we, I mean saying slave owners and enslavers. Recouping their investment, I guess, is the way that they were thinking. It was much more business oriented, but did this is a good example of seeing different dynamics and how different areas of the country, which is now about to be a country for real, because it's about to settle for peace with the British, had different attitudes towards it. In New England, the day in and day out interaction with the institution of slavery was very different than it was in New York, was very different than it was in Virginia, was very different than it was in South Carolina. And, that becomes one of the biggest challenges during the Constitutional Convention, is figuring out how to basically keep all of those different incentives together. That becomes one of the biggest priorities. But this is our first experience with it in this show. I have a feeling that this is probably the last. Based on the way that it was handled and how it was doing. So it's there, obviously not explored thoroughly. If you're watching the show and want this to be and are interested, there are plenty of other books and other materials that you can go to familiarize yourself. Dr. Franklin's writing amongst them. But I think we can move on because since the show doesn't explore it too much, we can save that particular conversation for another time. There is an interesting issue with the negotiation that takes place at the very beginning, which is your health. It crops up, and John Adams thinks you're faking it, essentially, for sympathy with Virgin. But
like most things, John Adams was wrong.
Yeah, but there's you have it's mentioned in a previous episode that you have a bladder stone, and that's what's the little devil's cropping up again.
It's very enfeebling, very painful, and despite the time in France being lovely, I suffer from the terrible diagnosis of being an old man. My gout has rendered movement difficult, and internally, the bladder stone, causing various obstructions of the humors, renders any position I find myself in to be terribly painful. And it's curious that Mr. Douglas's Franklin should speak when Bancroft and he are discussing the possible necessity of surgery. That I remark upon, if only there were a mechanism or means through which it could pass easier. Now, this surprised me because 20 years prior to that, no, maybe perhaps 30 years prior to this, my brother had a similar condition, a similar problem, a stone that could not be passed. And despite the surgeries, there are other means through which this can be done. The mechanism of a catheter, which at that time was stiff and inflexible, essentially a rod. And I invented in 17. Brace yourselves. And I invent a mechanism that is flexible. And I will not go into details as to why that is better, but perhaps those amongst you can discern why that would be.
I mean, I think flexible being something flexible being inserted into any orifice of the body is probably a better idea than something rigid.
Are you quoting someone?
No one that I care to name.
That's my treatise against the Stamp Act. I think you just quoted.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Got him.
So that invention existed at the time, and
and you had invented it.
I had invented it. It was one of my inventions, and so it's curious that Mr. Douglas's Franklin did not bring that to light, even in the scope of mentioning it and saying there's no way it can be used in this scenario, but at least you acknowledge that it exists.
Right.
And even then, it's a wonderful teaching opportunity for history and conflict between Franklin and Bancroft.
Now, this also feels very strange to me because in the modern day, the medical profession is incredibly medical profession. Doctors are incredibly professionalized. It's a very specific skill set that you have to go to many years of schooling to go through. And those who create medical devices are also similarly specialized. What was surgery like at the time? Like, so people were just, you know, cutting people open, seeing what happens. There were, I
So
mean, Bancroft is a doctor, but
the medical profession that you speak on now is in early development
okay.
in my time. Doctors are considered professionals to the same degree that a lawyer would be, but a physician is prized over a doctor.
Oh,
Doctors have a bit of a reputation for practicing in the taverns, for being little more than butchers, and for meddling in, uh, let's say, practices that are successful if you're generous 50% of the time.
okay.
Physicians devote themselves more to the study of medicine than the execution and practice of it. Perhaps that should be a better way to discern the
Gotcha.
two. Um, you know, a we're not far from the era where someone who is a barber is also a surgeon,
Hmm.
um,
Right.
practicing medicine. We're not far from an age where we thought bloodletting and purging was the best mechanism to make one well, to regulate the humors of the body. We're not terribly far past that, and we are past that. We are entering into the modern age of medicine, but we're also arriving into the time where we're beginning to learn about anatomy through the examination of cadavers.
Hmm.
This is where I'm not sure if you're aware. There's a reputation in your time that I had a dark secret life
As what?
as a murderer.
Murderer.
Yes, in the 1990s, long after my time, they're renovating the house that I lived in Craven Street,
Okay.
and they find different things tracing back to the 18th century and its history. And one of the things they found was a skull. And as
Okay.
they dug, they found more bones and more bones and more bones, and not just the quantity, but the things done to them. Hatch marks, evidence of dissection. They find the remains of 6 humans, and they trace when these bodies were there, and it dates back to the time that I lived there.
You're kidding.
What were the bodies doing there? Why were they there when I lived there? What was I doing in that basement in Craven Street?
Yeah. What were you doing, Doctor?
Well, steady, I'm going to get there. All in good time. I'm going to get to the heart of the matter of this human dissection, if you'll allow the pun. I made the acquaintance in the 1760s with a Dr. William Hewson, who was opening a medical practice and anatomy school with his partner,
Hmm.
another Dr. William, Doctors William and William. Now, this other doctor was his greatest claim to fame is his sketches on anatomy, specifically in obstetrics,
Okay.
of studying female anatomy for the purpose of perfecting child rearing and childbirth. Uh, but they had a falling out, the two of them. You see,
Hmm.
Dr. William Hewson fell in love with the daughter of my landlady. The other Dr. William thought he was too distracted and was complaining because his friend was not spending enough time. It was a feud between two Williams. They had a falling out. They asked me to be intermediary between the two. I said, you need to sort it out between yourselves. I don't think either of you are wrong. I think you're both very smart and fine men. But Dr. William Hewson would eventually break into a separate school and would open an anatomy school and office in the basement of that Craven Street home.
Huh.
Now, where those bodies likely came from were there's several possibilities. The first is they're prisoners oftentimes those who are executed for crimes, specific crimes, would then have their bodies given to anatomy schools to study.
Hmm.
In truth, was a prohibitive uh, to against criminals. There were certain offenses like dueling where it was stated at the offset, if you were found guilty of dueling, your body would be given post-mortem to the anatomy school as a means to try and keep people away from
Right.
dueling.
We're not going to bury you. You're not going to be given the
You're
kind
not going to
of
be given alive to
yeah
anatomy schools.
yeah the dignity of a proper burial or whatever.
But another is what's called, what are called in the 19th century, resurrectionists or resurrection men, grave robbers, people
Oh
who
right.
would take corpses who had recently died and would, I believe you have an episode upon this,
We
if I'm
do
not
have an
mistaken.
episode upon it. That
Did you
practice
notice? Did
stretches.
you notice my very gentle lead-in, sir?
I did. I'm also very impressed with your knowledge of our library. Uh,
And so there, it's possible that that was another means, but
uh
I had very little to do with it. But this is how we over the next 100 years begin to advance through some of those truly dark means, and I hate to say it, but human suffering.
ah, that's unfortunate and brutal to imagine doing a lot of this without the benefits of modern anesthetic. To be honest, like anesthesia is a miracle.
But we had in my time laudanum, which is the same opiate derivative as your modern morphine,
Right.
with the same problematic after effects that take place.
Sure. Yeah. Um, well, I'm glad I didn't know that you had a bunch of skeletons not in your closet but in your basement. But, but I'm happy to know that you didn't put them there on purpose for for nefarious means.
I have no idea how they got there. I was holding them for a friend.
um, as far as the way the show is depicting these negotiations and leading towards a culmination, how do you feel encouraged about how it's just about what its trajectory is? There's some this particular episode ends with Mr. Bancroft handing some forged letters that are written by supposedly written by Temple to Mr. Adams. That's the
I
dramatic
think
cliffhanger at the end of the episode.
I think there is I think there's somewhat of a mistake that transpires in contemporary storytelling of running into the illusion that action, particularly action that drives a story, must be physical, must be an ailment, a
Hmm.
relationship, romance, murder. That these are the things essential to drive a story forward. And in reality, I think what serves this story or would serve this story better would be an investment of the stakes. There's almost a fear to not go too cerebral
Hmm.
for fear that an audience will not relate to it. And the
Sure.
reality is, the audience will relate to whatever you present them if you do it in the correct way. And I think that there is a fear, because this was an episode on diplomacy, that diplomacy can't sell, that emotion has to be involved, um, that there must be some action to drive the plot. Otherwise, we should never indulge in it. And so instead, what takes place is you end up giving a trickle of that cerebral action and states in a way that never takes root,
Hmm.
and try to supplement it with action that, one, did not truly happen that way, and two, is so odd and inessential to the plot that you can't invest and care about it.
Sure.
So I think that that is something that I saw with this episode, and make no mistake, it is difficult to sit in a room with obnoxious men for hours on ends and endeavor to find a compromise. Believe me, sir, I've sat in Congress long enough to know that.
Hmm.
But but all the same, there are means and mechanisms where this can be done. Look to William Shakespeare. Look to Cato. Look to um, demonstrations of thought and ideas that require very little action because the language and the emotion is secure enough in its place to be able to compel thought from a people. And remember, Shakespeare's writings were written for common people, groundlings, who, if they did not like something, would make it very, very
Right.
publicly known, and they would not wait until they left the theater to do so. And so I believe that I believe modern audiences are capable of more, and therefore I think those who tell stories should be bold enough to do more.
Hmm. Well, uh, hopefully this show ends as we're watching it in a bold fashion, and and we can be happy with the way it displays the culmination of your story there, as it pertains to the American Revolution itself. So, oh, I had one question before we end the stream. In that today is a holiday. I don't know if you're aware, called Memorial Day, and it's a national holiday. And I was curious about whether there were any. Obviously, there were no national holidays when you were younger because there was no national government. But I was curious whether there were any state holidays and what those might have been like. If there were times that people had, where cause for occasion that were not necessarily religious. This is
Hmm.
a
So
non-religious.
so that's a fine question, and a good majority of our festivities have to do with religious observances.
Mm-hmm.
They're stretched larger than they are in your time. So, for instance, Christmas is 12 days
Oh, oh well.
that follow Advent, which is a season of penitent reflection. Same with Easter. We follow these things somewhat more closely,
Hmm.
but other things, and in truth, the notion of a holiday or a respite from work or a time to observe special occasions, it's not as widely observed. But I did in my podcast an episode on the history of April Fool's Day,
Hmm.
which is a fascinating thing because there is no distinct root, because people tend to create origin stories as April Fool's stories to to entertain people. But there are customs like Poisson d'Avril, which is still done on occasion, that was done in the 18th century. More often than not, you're going to hold fetes or celebrations for things like the king's birthday.
Right.
This eventually moves to like Washington's birthday, where you'll have a ball or a party to culminate and celebrate an individual. If there's a great battle or victory, that would be cause for celebrating. In truth, and I know not if this is a if this becomes a larger philosophical conversation. People in the 18th century are not different from modern audiences in their desire to find any cause to celebrate.
Oh.
What's different is they will look to an event that happened, the end of a war, the celebration of a great battle, harvest, anything, and they will make the present a holiday worthy of celebrating.
Okay.
Versus every year on the anniversary of something or a
Hmm.
set day of the year, say, this day will be such and such day.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, Returning to John Adams reflects that the 2nd of July should be a day for celebrating and fireworks, that forevermore on the 2nd of July we'll be honoring our independence because that's when the vote took place
Right.
for independence. But we knew it, and we see it in France in the previous episode. The celebration of Independence Day in
Hmm.
France, a day of celebration. So the term holiday inherently is holy day, a day of observance and reverence of some religious ceremony. Um, so the invention of secular holidays is not quite there in my time yet, although we tiptoe on the acknowledgement of certain days.
Right. Oh, Neat. Well, always interesting to talk to you.
For instance,
Yeah.
to think of it, it's not uncommon in my time on the 5th of November to burn Guy Fawkes in effigy.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a great one. That's still not often celebrated, but there was a recent, not so recent anymore, but there was a movie that, that was relatively popular about probably about 15 years, 15, almost 20 years ago. My gosh, I'm getting old, like you, sir. That sort of reintroduced Guy Fawkes into the popular culture here. So the largest subset of the population is familiar with the 5th of November now. But yeah, that is a cool example. It is always great to talk to you and hear these new little tidbits that I'll be able to pull from your knowledge bank. Good doctor. And for those who were watching over the last 40 minutes or so, thank you so much for joining us. All of these conversations are brought to you and made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So please, if you feel so moved, to go check out patreon.com/primary source media. It doesn't cost anything to join, but there are tiers, increasing tiers that do cost money, but they give you more and more access to behind the scenes things, early access to our content, and even some book giveaways from signed authors that we interview on Too Complicated for History. And if you are as enamored with the doctor as I am, please listen to his podcast, Let's Be Frank, available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Video versions of that podcast actually drop on this YouTube channel, so make sure you subscribe to this. And a new video episode of his podcast is premiering as soon as we finish this conversation. So you can go right from here to go watching that. And as always, thank you so much for being with me, Doctor, for chatting with me. It has been a pleasure.
You're humble and obedient, always a privilege.
All right, everybody. Take care. Enjoy your Memorial Day.